Hello, welcome to part 2 of the drop-in, drop-out local co-op multiplayer kind of game we're making. Just to show you where we were in part 1, as a bit of a refresher. If we hit play, we can press space or a button on the keyboard, we can have one player, and then if we hit A on a controller, then we can have two players. But we want our players to spawn automatically into the world. Especially player 1. We want player 1 to be there kind of as the level starts. We want player 1 to be in the world. And I showed off the annoying bug in last week's video, where if player 1 is already in the world, it seems to work until you add a second player. And then if we leave the player input, you can see that it's got a missing input action asset there, which is a bit of a pain. We have to hook it back up every time. But we are going to solve that today. So the first thing we want to do is we need to make a spawn point for our player to actually spawn at. So let's find our camera. Let's just make sure I'm looking at it from the same perspective as the camera. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go game object, create empty. I'm just going to call this spawn point prefab. And under tag, I'm going to add a tag. I'm going to tag it with spawn point. We select our spawn point and tag it spawn point. And I'm going to just center it in the world. I'm going to give it a little bit of a gizmo billboard thing so we can see where it is. And I'm just going to drag it, making sure that the Y is at 0. And I'm just going to drag it over sort of maybe to here in the corner. We will come back to that in a little bit. Okay, so in the last episode, we made this game manager script just ahead of time. We didn't actually put anything in it, so let's open this up and change this. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make this be an instance, because we want to be able to access the game manager from like everywhere, any other script. But obviously it needs to be a mono behavior, so it can be attached to a game object, so we can't really make it static. So an instance is the best way to do that. And the way we're going to do that is for now, I'm just going to get rid of the start and update, and I'm going to do call this instances, just so we can keep track and keep it organized. We want to do a public static game manager instance and instance and set this to null. And then in our void awake method, we want to say that if the instance is equal to null, then then instance equals this. So this is the instance. If there isn't a version of this in the game anywhere, that this is the one to make. Else if the instance is not null, in other words, if there is already an instance of the game manager in the world, we just want to destroy that game object because we don't want two versions of the game manager to exist at any one time. Okay, so now that's taken care of. That's the instance set up. The next thing we need is a public game object array called spawn points. And we could set these up manually, or we could make the game kind of search for them and do it that way. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to do spawn points equals game object dot find objects with tag, and I want that to be spawn point, I believe I called it. Spawn point, yep. So that should search for that. And it should add any objects that it finds with the tag spawn point to our spawn point array. And then in void start, what we want to do is we want to get the player input manager dot instance, and we need to using Unity engine dot input system. We do the player input manager dot instance dot join player. You can see here that it's looking for a player index, a split screen index, a control scheme, and pair with device, which is the device that the player's using that you want to associate the player with that device. For now, obviously this is going to be the first player, and we know that because we're joining them manually, and we know that this will be the first player, so we can give them an index of 0. For the split screen index, we're not using split screen, so we can -1, which is null, and then the control scheme, it's null because that'll be decided by what controller they're using anyway, and we don't have to provide anything for the fourth argument parameter. So this is going to set the player index to 0. Yeah, so we're not doing split screen. If you want me to cover that in the comment, if you want me to cover split screen, let me know in the comments below, and I can certainly take a look into that. Okay, so for now, let's just move this back out of the way and take a look back at our project. If we go to the game manager and we look at the player input manager here, we can see that on send messages, it says will send message to game object, on player joined and on player left, and we can listen out for those messages by adding a method with that name. So we can do void on player joined, and this takes in a player input, and we can just call this player input. And we can just copy this, paste it, and on player left. So now if we run this, just for now on player joined, I'm going to debug.log player joined the game. Hello. So if we go back to Unity, hit play, press space, it says player joined the game, hello, and then player index 0 is already taken by player input, blah, blah, blah. The reason for that error is that on the game manager, we've got it to join players when button is pressed. We want to set this to join players manually. I'm actually going to uncheck limit number of players because it doesn't really matter for this. If you want to only have 2 players or 4 players, you can put that there. But I'm just going to uncheck that for simplicity's sake. Okay, so we've got join behavior, join players manually. So now if we press play, we've joined a player manually. We can move our player as usual. If we press A, nothing's happening on the controller because we're trying to join the player manually. And the reason for this issue here is because we already have a player input in the world, which is a pain that I missed that. But if we hit play, you see that player join game, hello. And then if we press A on the controller, nothing happens because we had our game manager set to join players manually. So that's working now. So we hit play, player 1, pop, already in the game. So how can we make this, how can we make it, so how can we make them spawn at the spawn point? Well, because we made the game manager an instance, now in the player input handler, where it says start pause, what we can actually do is we can do game manager dot instance, and we actually just want to make sure that, yep, that's public, so that's fine. We can do game manager dot instance dot spawn points, and for now we can just say dot transform dot position. So for now we'll just we can just do that. If we go back and hit play, see that we've started over at the spawn point down here. Okay, so for now we'll leave that as 0. We'll come back to that once we actually have the co-op implementation working and we can assign different spawn points to different players. Okay, so in the game manager, we don't want this to just debug.log that we've joined the game. What we want to do is we can make a public list of player inputs, and we'll just call this player list, and we'll equal this to a new list of player inputs. So in the onPlayer joined, we're going to get playerlist.add, and then we are going to add the player input. We're going to add the player input that we've just received. And then we are going to make up at the top, we're going to make a events category, and we're going to do public event system dot action, action player input, and we're going to just call this player joined game. I'm just going to duplicate this and player left game, which we'll use that a bit later maybe. So in playerlist.add, so a player is going to join the game. We want to add that player to our player list. If the player joined game event has subscribers, then we're going to call the event and pass in the player input. So now if anything is subscribed to this event on the game manager, that we'll be able to send the player input to any of the scripts that wants it. Okay, so the next thing that we need, we want to get some public input actions. We want this to be the join action, and we want a leave action. I found that putting these as public, it doesn't seem to actually work. You have to leave them as private and serialize field. Put serialized field in front of them. So now if we go back to Unity, we can go to the game manager and we can see that we've got join action and leave action. And this works in the same way as kind of the input manager, but you're just having like a very specific button. It's not part of like a player map or anything. So we want to do join action, add binding, and I'm going to listen for either the space bar, which is obviously going to come from the keyboard, or I'm going to listen out for the A button or button south on a gamepad. And then for the leave action, I'm going to add in escape. And just in case you want to have players on the keyboard, but I'm going to also have the back button or select button on a gamepad. And for this leave action, I want to click the little cog here, and under interactions, we're going to add hold. And what that basically means is that a player will have to hold the back button for 0.5 seconds before they can leave. This is obviously just to stop them pressing it by mistake and just leaving and losing their progress or their score or whatever. So then back to our game manager script. In void awake, before you can use those actions, you have to enable them by just calling join action.enable and leave action.enable. And then, so we then need to subscribe a method to sort of, as a delegate, to listen out for that. Then we need, so now what we need to do is we want to, when the action's performed, we want to subscribe a method to the action to be triggered when a player presses either A or holds back on the controller. So what we're going to do is we're going to do join action dot performed. So when it's pressed, and then we're going to do plus equals context, little arrow, and then join action context. And that's just given us an error. So we want void join action input action dot callback context, and we'll copy that, paste it, do void leave action, and then we can just copy all of that up to the period there, and then just put leave action dot performed context leave action context. Okay, that sounds really confusing. So essentially, we've got our input action, which is the join action, which we added the A button for. When that, and then we have to enable the action on awake. And then once a player performs that action, so hits A or holds back for 0.5 seconds, we're going to pass the context from this, which is the input action dot callback context. We're going to get the context out of this, and we're going to pass it into this method. Okay, so the join action is simple enough. What we want to do is we want to do player input manager dot instance dot join player from action if not already joined, and then we can pass in the context, which is essentially the controller that they've it's like the button that's been pressed, but what this is doing is getting the controller from that button, I believe. So if we go back to the game, hit play. So our first player is spawned in automatically at the spawn point prefab. We press A on the controller, and player 2 is spawned. I can see the empty here that we parented to the prefab is way over there for some reason. It's not a problem necessarily. It's a bit weird that that's happening, but you know what? Never mind. We could probably fix that quite easily by saying in our script for the player input handler, when we do the transform.parent, we can do transform.position equals player controller.transform.position. There we go. So we can see that the player input handler is now actually just set where the player is. When we press A, we've got 2 players. Okay, so that's the drop in part of the drop in, drop out local co-op done. We're going to drop in. You can see that the player input, it keeps the reference to its action scheme. If we go over to the game manager, you can see that here, player 0, move over, press A, I've got player 1. If I pick up a second controller, press A, we've now got 3 players, all moving independently, all with their own control methods. Oh, I fell off the edge. It's quite hard to press the keyboard and 2 controllers at the same time. But yeah, like I said, that's the drop in part done. In part 3, we'll cover the drop out part of the drop in, drop out co-op multiplayer. Make sure to hit the subscribe button if you want to see when part 3 comes out, and hit the notification bell, then you'll be alerted. As always, the project files for this are over on Patreon, as is the full series of these tutorials. So if you don't want to wait for each weekly kind of release, you can go over to the Patreon, subscribe. They're all already up there. But yeah, in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.